Shrug family, this week on Barbell Shrugged, Dr. Michael T. Nelson, one of my favorite human beings on this entire planet. Not only has he been my coach past year, but when I first met Mike T. Nelson, like many years ago, I want to say it's like 6-7 years ago now, we were at Paleo FX, if any of you fitness nerds remember that fun event in Austin, Texas. That means you've been around for a long time. He was one of the very first people that I interviewed. I think we talked for 3 straight hours about micronutrients, and I literally could not believe that humans on this planet were that smart that they could just sit down and recite the optimal levels of every single micronutrient, where to get it, what foods are best for it, how it relates to your physiology, the results you would get if they were at an optimal level. Like, it blew my mind. And to this day, 6-7 years later, still my homie, and we get to hang out on Barbell Shrugged. As always, friends, make sure you get over to rapidhealthreport.com. That is where you can learn all about all the lab, lifestyle, and performance testing, analysis, and program design that we will be doing for you when you enter into Rapid Health Optimization. And you can access all of that over at rapidhealthreport.com. Friends, let's get into the show. Welcome to Barbell Shrugged. I'm Anders Warner, Doug Larson, Coach Travis Mash, and a man that has taken me from a slightly above average mile to a 6-minute and 17-second mile, making me the fittest 41-year-old in my house because there's only one. The hero to only my children, Dr. Michael T. Nelson. Welcome to the show. This is like
Awesome.
show number like 12 or 13, I feel like, of you. Like an enormous you basically you're in the family, man. This is so great. Today, we're going to be digging into metabolic flexibility, which is that's like your thing. That's like your big course, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Flex Diet Cert. Bingo.
Before we dig into kind of the new things you're riffing on, can you give us like a high level understanding of metabolic flexibility for people that have not heard you talk about it in the past?
Yeah, in the fitness world, as you guys all know, like if you want to write a good book, you just demonize a whole macronutrient group. Like, carbs are bad, you don't need any of those. And then, fat's bad too, and too much protein, your kidneys will fly out of your back when you're deadlifting or something like that. Like all these horrible things are going to happen to you. And the reality, obviously, for listeners, that none of those are really true. So metabolic flexibility looks at the 2 main fuels, which are carbohydrates and fats. So on one end of the spectrum, how well can you use carbohydrates? And then also, how well can you use fats as a fuel? And the third component then is how well can you switch back and forth between those two, depending on what you're actually doing. This is a very healthy person should be able to do that. So if you're like, Travis, you're going to go squat, front squat a bunch of ungodly amount of weight, you're going to use a high amount of carbohydrates. If we're just hanging out having this conversation here, the preferred fuel would actually be fat because we don't have a lot of intensity going on. The metabolic flexibility is how well you use carbohydrates, how well you use fat, and then how well can you switch back and forth between those 2 main fuel sources.
Yo, did you coin that term, by the way? I know that you're in this space, but did you actually say that phrase for the first time and turn it into a thing?
No, the credit for that actually goes back to David Kelly in 2000. And it's interesting because the previous work would be the crossover method, which of Brooks and Mercier, which is 1992. And you can find stuff all the way back to, I think the earliest reference I could find was 1897, was like Montague talking about competitors eating bread before exercise as a way to optimize performance. So like you can find hundreds of years back like the concept, but it was Dr. Kelly that first coined the official term metabolic flexibility in 2000.
Well, to find out which is better, do you just go by the activity you're about to do, or are some people better constructed for carbs and some better for fats?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways you can look at it. So in the lab, you would run, like say a max test using a metabolic cart. So everybody's seen the little machine you breathe into that, takes all your air and looks at it. And what the machine is doing is it's looking at the amount of air that goes in and out, but it's also looking at oxygen and CO2. And what that can tell you then is your percentage of fats versus carbohydrates. And what you'll see on every test is if you start out with a slow warm-up, most of that fuel will originally be from fat. And then as you get into a higher intensity exercise, at some point, you're using all just carbohydrates towards max.
Right.
And that's what I was told, and that's what every exercise physiology book will tell you. And if you take enough people and you average it out, that is 100% correct. But as you guys know, there's a lot of variability on an individual level. And that crossover point, that point where you're burning 50% fat and 50% carbohydrates, that actually can vary quite a bit from one individual to the next. And the cool part is you can move that around by your training. So if you have a harder time using carbohydrates, you can then train to get better at that. If you have a harder time using fat as a fuel, you can train to get better at that too. There's some super cool follow-up studies because the longest time I thought, oh, well, if you're just at low intensity exercise, all the books say you're just burning mostly fat. But
Right.
then when you look at individuals and you work in the real world, you're like, I don't know, this doesn't seem to add up because energetically, you could substitute carbohydrates for that. We won't get into the metabolism of that. So when you look at the studies, there's 3 studies that have been done now. They took average people that were recreationally active, pulled them in off the street, stuck them in a lab, and measured how well they're using fat on low to moderate intensity exercise. Gadecki did this once. Helges did this in 1999. I published some research on this 2015. And what you find is the variability is like 20 to 93%, meaning some of those people are really good at using fat at low intensity exercise. Some of them suck absolutely horribly at doing that, but yet these are generally considered the recreationally healthy individuals. So on the low end of the spectrum, how well your body is using fat as a fuel can actually vary quite a bit from one person to the next.
So is that purely a function of fitness? We'll say it's like the embedded as you get in better and better shape, relative intensity changes. And so at a certain intensity, if you're in better shape, you'd be more likely to be using fat as fuel because it's just a lower percentage of your max, we'll say. Does it go the other way too, though? You were talking about, like, that's generally how I think about it. But you said that some people, you can train yourself to be better at using carbohydrates. How do you do that? That was not what I expected you to say there.
Yeah, so on the low end of the spectrum, you're correct. But what they did is super cool, and we did this in a study I ran. We baselined each person to their VO2 max. So they came into the lab, they did a VO2 max first, and then they said, okay, we're going to put you at, 20 to 30% of your VO2 max. So relative intensity of exercise was fixed on an individual basis. Otherwise, you're correct. Someone with a monster VO2 is going to be way different than someone with a low VO2, just because that same work may be way sub-max for one person and maybe close to max for somebody else. So they did baseline it to a percentage of them so that the relative intensity is the same across each individual. So it's interesting that variability still stood out even once they did that. On the carbohydrate end of the 2 biggest things are primarily going to be, I would say, there's insulin independent and insulin mediated mechanisms. So when insulin's around, you've got this thing called the GLUT4 translocation, goes out to the edge of the cell, and it can take in carbohydrates. But what people forget is that a lot of that can be mediated in a non-insulin environment, meaning that if you're just walking around, pure muscle contraction in and of itself can actually pull glucose directly out of the bloodstream independent of insulin. And there's some pretty cool studies done in dogs where they took out their pancreas and did a whole bunch of measurements. And again, harder to do some of those studies in humans, but just general movement in and of itself is probably number 1. Number 2, obviously related to muscle mass. The bigger muscle mass you have, the more sink you have to get rid of fuels is going to be better. Last component I would say is how much higher intensity work you're doing. Because we know that as you scale up to higher intensity work, the percentage of carbohydrates you're going to use is going to be more. However, if you're doing true high intensity work, how much work you can do there is limited. So you're kind of looking for this sweet spot, I would say, of moderate, higher intensity exercise, but not all out. Let's do 20-second repeats on the bike or the rower and try to kill ourselves in 2 minutes.
So a lot of this seems like it would happen organically if you just trained you had a well-constructed training program that was goal-oriented for your sport, then all these changes and adaptations would just kind of naturally fall into place. To what extent are you almost deviating from training for the sport in a specific way to try to optimize the nutrient partitioning that you're kind of suggesting here?
Yeah, a lot of it does shockingly look like good training programming, which a lot of stuff does, right? That's why it's called a good training program. How it's a little bit different, I would say, is some people will probably have some limiter that they may want to address. So if I look at endurance athletes first, so years ago, I actually saw athletes who were high-level endurance athletes literally did not have a crossover effect, meaning they never got to the point, no matter how low the intensity, where they got below 50% carbohydrate use. Now, if they could keep carbohydrates coming in all the time during longer races, they did pretty good. They actually did really good. But if
Mm.
they missed a station, they had some GI issues, they had some other issues,
Mm.
like their race was a complete total disaster. You could also argue from a health standpoint, probably not the most healthy either. On more of the strength side, you can look at some advanced work where they will try to prioritize, I would say, as a eustress model. We're going to give you enough carbohydrates so that you can perform high intensity work. But they've done a few fascinating studies where they did kind of the approach where they would limit carbohydrates and still have you do high intensity work. And what they're doing is they're trying to get these molecular adaptations that when you pull the nutrient out that you're using, but you're still exercising there, the body goes, oh crap, we don't have that around, so we're going to ramp up some of the enzymes and all this production of other things there.
Mm.
And what it looks like is just absolutely horrible.
I was gonna say,
You
is
may
that
come in,
upsetting?
it is hideous. So what it would look like is you would come into the lab, let's say in the afternoon, and we're going to do repeated high intensity work of 2, 4, 5 minutes because we're going to try to deplete out as much glycogen as we can, right? Maybe get it down to 40%. You can't drive it to zero. And then you're going to leave the lab. You're going to go home and have just like some protein and go to bed. You're going to wake up the next morning. You're going to come back to the lab again. And now we're going to brutalize you again with more high intensity interval stuff. Because after an overnight sleep, your liver glycogen is relatively low, but your muscle glycogen is fine. Under these conditions, we depleted out a lot of that muscle glycogen on day one, did not replete it. We just barely gave you some protein. And so now you're coming back to the lab on day two, and you're doing this high intensity work on a low liver glycogen and a low muscle glycogen. And what you'll see is that it's horrible. Athletes hate it. Your HRV plummets, your stress goes through the roof. But done in a short controlled period of time, the research studies on this are split like 50-50. You may see some pretty big benefits. So like Marquette was the first one that published this in MedSci, I think 2016. And they showed increase in 5K times, increase in running efficiency, and better body composition in 2 weeks done by DEXA,
Mm.
literally with the same calories in both groups. They just prioritize them in different orders by doing the training this way. Gail did a follow-up study a year later, didn't see any big changes to it. So the studies on that are still split, and we're wondering like how far do you have to go or whatever. So what I tell athletes in practice then, if you're kind of getting close to your upper level, your plateau, you're having enough carbohydrates, you're doing good training, all that stuff, you may consider doing like a distress session of prioritizing the adaptation over performance acutely. Run that for a few days to maybe a week or two, then go back to giving carbohydrates before exercise and see if you have an improvement. Again, you would only try this, in my opinion, if athletes are getting close to a plateau. You would definitely only do it off season because for those 1 or 2 weeks that you're doing it, your performance is going to absolutely tank. And they're going to hate you because I've tried doing some of this stuff. It is like high intensity work by itself is miserable. This makes it even more miserable if that was even possible.
There's got to be a lot of trust between you and the athlete at that point as well,
Oh,
where
100%. Because they think you're insane.
yeah, it's going to be rough, and their performance is going to go down in the short term. It's kind of like
Yep.
getting a new client and telling them you're going to do this new thing, and they want to lose body fat, and then their weight goes up 3 pounds in the first couple of days, and then they
I
fucking
go freak out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very advanced method for sure. And again, like the research is still split. It's not like all the research says, oh, this is a 100% winner if you do it. And there's a lot of unknowns. So what I do is I will watch their HRV and I'll have a design sort of stop point ahead of time. Like, okay, it's chronically down like 12 points. We're going to pull the plug and I'm going to say that's probably enough stress for now. So I tell people when you do this, like talk to your athletes, whether you use RPE or use a certain drop of performance, whatever it is, have some agreement so that they know that this is very short and very limited. Because otherwise, they think you're just going to torture them for weeks on end, and that's not going to end well.
So I'd assume you want to do this well away from a comp because you wouldn't want to.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely off season. Do not do this in season. It's a horrible idea to do in season.
Yeah. Sounds like it could possibly like take somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the hard part with a lot of the advanced stuff, right? You're running on the bleeding edge of if you do just enough, you're probably good. If you do too much, oops, now you kind of went over that edge. Like you're walking the tightrope like pretty narrow.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way it goes there with all elite
That's the way it
training.
goes with everything, though, on that part.
Totally.
Yeah.
When you're at that end range, it's like you got to be careful when you try these new things.
Yeah. But some of the things that you try are the thing that actually in high level athletes make a big difference, as you guys know.
It could.
So yeah. But it's a cool concept. Like the backup to that is you don't have to go that extreme. You can do things where you just drop liver glycogen and maybe you do some zone 2 stuff or some easy aerobic stuff that morning. So if I back up from that extreme end, that's typically how I'll program client stuff. So let's say Tuesday, Thursday is just an easy aerobic development. You're going to do that in the morning. Great. I'm going to have you do that fasted because we know insulin levels are going to be lower. Liver glycogen is going to be lower. Muscle glycogen is still going to be there if we need it, but we want to prioritize fat as the main fuel to run through the system. It's moderate intensity. We don't need carbohydrates to hit that performance. So my bias is I will do that at that point to upregulate the body's use of fat. And then we'll come back maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, might have higher amounts of carbohydrates. We're going to prioritize lifting more stuff, and we're going to look for performance on that day. So you can kind of periodize it a little bit throughout the week, what I call match macros, making sure that the macronutrients match the actual training stimulus. I've seen a lot of really good training programs. I've seen a lot of really good nutrition, but you can look at them and it's like, oh my God, these two people never talk to each other. And that can work to a point, but I think having those things like two wheels on a bicycle, like working together, especially if you're trying to get better body composition and performance goals, that makes just a lot more sense.
So this seems to be much further on the performance side than the health side. Of course, there's a massive crossover with those two things
Yes.
in many ways. But for someone who's just trying to be healthy and they're not a professional athlete and trying to hit some specific performance goal other than just to generally be stronger and leaner and all the things, like to what degree do they need to worry about this specific idea or concept?
I would argue that they can get by not having to worry about it, but I think it's a faster road. Because we know that metabolic flexibility is actually a good marker for health also at the same time. If we look at a disease state, so a disease state would be someone who's pretty advanced as a type 2 diabetic. So in that condition, we all know that they have an issue using carbohydrates on the right end of the spectrum. But as the disease progresses, they actually start losing the ability to downregulate and use fat as a fuel. So one of the main compensation factors the body has is to increase insulin. So we know as type 2 diabetics progress, insulin levels tend to go up higher and higher. When insulin levels are higher, it's harder for the body to downregulate to a low insulin state to use fat as a fuel. So if you imagine carbohydrates on one end and fats on the other end like a barbell, they're actually getting squished on both ends. They're losing the ability to use carbohydrates. They're losing the ability to use fat. So if we back up then and say, okay, so someone who just wants to be more healthy and have more performance goals, I actually kind of use the same approach with them, just not as aggressive. So if they're doing some aerobic stuff, I still ideally would have them do it fasted. But for some people, that may be like, hey, just get up in the morning and do a fasted walk for 30 minutes, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, formal training. Again, a lot of it depends on the constraints of their schedule, that type of thing. But my argument would be that the same things that the higher level athletes are doing, if we just scale that down, even if like health is kind of the top priority, if I can make someone more metabolically flexible, I'm going to be able to make them more healthy. And on the flip side, if you drop all this into the real world, we know that like social things are going to happen. Like they're going to go out with friends. They may end up face first in a birthday cake. They're going to end up with these high carbohydrate insults at times. And if their body is better able to handle those high carbohydrates, usually I find that their appetite isn't as dysregulated the next day. Weight gain is usually more maintained. It's much easier for them to get back on schedule the next day also.
Hmm. What about the nutrition side of this? Are there certain like patterns or methods you use when you're implementing these tactics?
In terms of like nutrition, like macronutrient type stuff,
Yeah.
usually protein will be relatively fixed. It doesn't change much, around 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. And then for healthier people, I usually generally set fat a little bit lower, 70, 80, 90 grams per day. Again, there are some exceptions to that. And then carbohydrates are the main thing that'll fluctuate the most. And so initially, I may start someone on just a very simple, what I call just a flat macro approach. I know Dan's talked about this too. Let's just find maintenance. Let's just find where you're at. Let's just find your total calories. Let's just start pretty simple. We may do that for a couple of weeks. And then after that, once that's, kind of plateaued a little bit, now I might go a little bit higher on carbohydrates on lifting days and a little bit lower on carbohydrates on the cardio days, because you don't really need that much fuel for low to moderate intensity cardio. From a compliance standpoint, I find that most people kind of like this a little bit more, because if they don't have a lot of calories to work with initially while you're kind of working them up, they have days that they can have more carbohydrates, as opposed to having days that are all this kind of low to moderate level. Again, there's some people who don't prefer that approach either. And then over time, if you're really trying to get more extreme for, body comp type things, those deviations between the high carb day and the low carb day might get more extreme. So you may have, 2, 3, 400, 500 grams of carbs one day, and you may have like 120, 200 the next day. Again, the nice part is that all of this is scalable to the person and to where their limits are at also. In general, I don't really have anyone go below 100, 110 grams of carbs total per day. I call that the metabolic no man's land, where you're like around 110 to like, 30. You're not low enough to really be a ketogenic approach. So you don't have ketones and you just feel crappy. You don't have enough energy. And I've lost track of like how many clients have come in who are like trying to do weight loss and get healthy, and their carbohydrates are like 95 grams a day. And it's like, how do you feel? They're like, I feel like crap. Like, how's your performance? It's pretty bad. All right, let me guess. You're stuck at a plateau. Like, yep. How did you know? What they don't tell you is that they usually have very high carbohydrate days on weekends, social events, things like that. So their totals are a little bit higher, but they've been told they just need to have this like super low carb approach. And yeah, in that area, I just find it just doesn't work well at all.
Are you talking about shifting? Like, so when you have your low carb days, are you going to then have more fats? And then when you shift to higher carbs, are you going to take from the fats? Are you standardizing the daily macros, or is that waving up and down as well?
Yeah,
Daily calories.
Yeah.
You're saying
So-
stabilizing the daily calories, but shifting the macro.
Yeah, is that what he's talking about?
Yeah, so
You
what
know
I'll
what?
do actually is I will actually shift calories by changing carbohydrate amount, and I'll generally just leave fat the same.
Okay.
With rare circumstances. So what happens then is you have days that are probably a little high on calories and days that are lower. And we can
So
play
you're just
with,
trying to average. All
yeah.
right.
So
Right.
the average then will come out to be, are we trying to gain weight? Are we trying to lose weight? Are we just trying to maintain?
Maintain. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
And usually from people doing it in a compliance standpoint, there's only one thing that's really changing, right? So if they know what their higher calorie, carb foods are, they'll have more of those on the days that they're lifting, and they don't really have to worry about changing a whole lot else. So it does make it easier for them to execute also.
Yeah. And then how are you, is there a path in which people are even getting more detailed when it comes to workout timing and nutrition timing around those workouts, where they do want to be having most of those carbohydrates around the workout and then as they get further away, prioritizing the fat?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I definitely do that if their calories are on the lower side and their goal is still performance and health. So if you only have 160 grams of total carbohydrates to work with per day, I'm probably going to bracket most of those before and after your training. If you're at, like, at one client is at 450 grams of carbs, like you timing's taking care of it. Like, you're already having carbs before and after training by just eating, 4 meals a day. You're having over 100 grams of carbs at each meal. But I do find as calories do go down, because calories in, calories out is a real thing based on physics, that prioritizing more of them around training, and even sometimes before training or intra training, when the calories get really low, definitely helps, because we're trying to do everything we can to preserve that performance. Even if they're not a performance athlete, like, that performance is what's driving how much muscle you're going to hold on to, how many calories you're going to burn. And we want to partition the loss of calories out of the system, ideally from fat and not muscle. And the biggest mistake I've seen people make is they'll just slash all their calories too hard, and then their training performance just tanks with it. And then they lose a fair amount of muscle and they can't figure out why. And it's just their performance outcome when they're training just dropped a lot. So they don't have that same stimulus on their body to hold on to as much of that tissue as they did before.
And the average person still can tell when they're weak. I mean, I know so many men that I coach that are, I have several people about my age who are trying to stay fit as they get older. And if they're bench press, of all things, of course, if it dips,
Monday,
they hate it. They hate it, man. They don't care what happens. Nobody wants to be what?
Yeah, no, that's
I don't
true.
want to. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, even if I have clients who are not competitive, like, we track all their performance pretty closely, because if I see a big drop in it relative to their baseline, wherever their baseline is, this is fine. I know something's off, like stress went up, compliance went up, or something like that. Or, I mean, you guys have been around gyms your whole life. You walk into a commercial gym, how many people even write anything down? Like, there's no way you remembered your third set on Monday of bench press. You did 5 reps instead of 6. Like, you don't remember any of that. And I highly doubt they're on their phone typing in all their stuff into True Coach or Coach Catalyst or something like that. They're usually scrolling cat memes or God knows whatever else they're doing. So
Exactly. I remember doing bodybuilding for 6 weeks when I was in college. And for about 5 of those weeks, I was like, this is easy. I was getting leaner. Life is good. Enter week 6, and my bench press plummeted. And I immediately quit. I was like, this sucks.
Follow his lead, guys.
I was like,
so I just quit.
My bench press, I didn't care about anything, but all of a sudden 315 was hard. And I'm like, I quit. I'm like, no. My ego got hit. And so if we can maintain that ego a little bit, it would help someone like me for sure.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, a lot of people who start off, when I work with them, like, their calories may not be that far off, but they're just so weirdly distributed throughout the day. And if you see their performance going down, and if you can just move calories around and fix their performance, they're like, oh my gosh, you're such a magician. This is amazing. Like, you saved my bench press. And
absolutely.
They're like your client for life now.
Yeah, I would have been your client for life. Absolutely.
With your own clients, what are all the things that you track and measure and whatnot on kind of a daily, weekly basis? I know all the stuff we do here at Rapid, and you help us out on kind of the sleep tracking side of things and analysis. And you've done many other things here with us as well. I call you our Swiss Army knife. You can kind of do it all.
You seriously can.
Which is a huge compliment, for the record.
Oh, thank you.
But with your own clients, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I switched to, it's a kind of more a systematic view probably about 7 or 8 years ago. That was right around where you could get HRV daily on your smartphone, which was great. So pretty much everyone will look at HRV. It's a good marker of stress. They'll just do the measurement one time in the morning. Again, we've got Aura, we've got other ways of looking at it. They'll have their pros and cons. You just have to know what you're looking for on that. Really big on measuring pretty much all sets, reps, etc. And it's not as hard as it sounds, because everyone has their programming in there. You just simply write, what you did for how many reps. Rest periods we look at a little bit, but I do it more intuitive. Like those are allowed to change as long as they can keep performance up and get all their training done. There are times we may collapse rest periods a little bit more on that. Obviously, they're doing any cardio, what their output on cardio is, like bike, rower, running, etc. Most people will log some form of nutrition. Like we do have some people that are habit-based, so they're maybe just tracking protein or tracking fiber or things like that. More advanced clients are tracking, all of their macros in different days and times. A fair amount of stuff with sleep. You can use the Garmin, Apple, Aura is much better for sleep. As long as you know what you're looking at for that. Like I heard Andy talk about this on the show recently, and I was just nodding my head that sleep stages are probably the last thing I'll look at in those things. But things like respiratory rate, what time you went to bed, what time you got up, your heart rate profile during sleep, all those things are super informative on the recovery side. And then for some people, if they are able to do it, we'll look at some basic blood work. Again, not for health stuff, but just for performance, and try to get just like a holistic idea of what's going on. They may have some assessments we may redo. That varies. Some people will check stuff every 4 weeks. Some people maybe every 4 months. Most programming is a 1 to 8 week phase, and at the end, I'm going to have them do just a series of AMRAPs. So they're going to take the same load they were using, and maybe we said a 8 to 12 rep range with maybe a 1 RAR. Okay, now you're going to take that same load and just do as many reps as you can with good form. And if they hit like 5 reps more than what they were doing before,
Boom.
it's like, all right, that's cool. But that also tells me the week before you were nowhere close to a 1 RAR either. I've sort of seen that go up over the course of weeks. So it's kind of a nice way of, one, checking to see if they're in the parameters you expect, and two, are they actually making performance without having to, redo 1RMs and a whole bunch of stuff that, high-level athletes are not going to do on that. And the last thing is just kind of how do they feel? Like I think we sometimes get a little bit, and I've been guilty of this in the past too, over quantitative of just only collecting numbers and forgetting to ask them, like, how do you feel? Like, do you feel like I've had a couple of clients in the past where I look at it on paper and I'm like, I don't know, this seems like a disaster. And then you talk to them, you're like, bro, how you doing? They're like, oh, this is amazing. I love this. I feel so much better. And, like they're qualitative, like everything is great. So I'm like, all right, cool. Let's go with that. I'm still going to try to, work on some of these metrics too. But I think just, simply in asking clients, like, how are you feeling like about the program and progress, I think is a very underrated, easy thing to do.
I think it opens up like conversations as well. Like,
Yes.
I do a subjective questionnaire daily. And so, and when I start to see performance taper off, I can go back to subjective questionnaire and start to get ideas of when it started, what happened, possibly. And so it just opens up those tough talks you got to have.
Yeah. And that's why I really like the daily HRV, because if I see a drop and I don't notice a performance change, I can't find anything else in the metrics, like their sleep wasn't off, I just circle it on the graph and I just literally send them an email of like, hey, what's going on? Because especially online, like you don't know, like I've had maybe that a big argument with their spouse. I've had people like their pet died, stuff I didn't even know that happened. And I'm like, okay, now we can have a conversation about it and see what's going on. Or sometimes you can't find anything. Sometimes you have to go looking to see what it was. And if that pattern keeps repeating, you're like, okay, something's going on. And then you just kind of need to play detective and figure out what it is. But similar to you, it just allows so many more conversations that in the past I would have completely missed until you get, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks down the road and all the wheels fell off the car and now it's like stuck in the ditch and now you got to try to fix it and get it back on the road.
Yeah. How much value do you put into HRV? And I say that because it's, for me personally, N equals just my life. I feel like that number, especially now that I have an 8 sleep mattress and an Aura, and those numbers are surprisingly similar on a daily basis.
Nice.
Like some of the other companies, I don't think they get it right.
No, I
Those
agree with
two, when they're dialed in, like as close as they are on a day-to-day basis, and then I add the subjective kind of just like, how do I feel when I get out of bed in the morning? It's wildly accurate. I can almost like if there's a day down in the 50s or something like that, I can totally feel it. And most of the time I'm 70 to 85-ish, something around there. And if I do have one of those days, there's usually some sort of stressor that has been added to life that I just didn't know was going on or didn't know it was as stressful. And the reason I ask is because for me personally, when I see those HRV numbers, I pretty much know how well I slept, how well training went on an intensity level the day before, or if there was just something out of the blue that kind of got me that I didn't really think was going on. Is that a metric that you actually put a good deal of value behind?
Yeah, I would say over the years, I probably used daily HRV readings for, God, almost a decade now. And at first, I was very wary of it. I had done research on it, published research on HRV as part of my PhD. But even then, I was still like, I don't know. There just wasn't a lot of daily info. But like time and time again, if it's done accurately, which is a big if for some other companies, it's pretty darn useful to the point now where if I see a big drop and I know the reading is done on a valid system and they didn't change the way that they were measuring it. I had one client who all of a sudden I looked at her HRV numbers and I'm like, these got way better, way fast. I said, what? This doesn't match performance or anything else. I said, did you do something different? Like something's going on. And she's like, well, yeah, you told me to measure them seated all the time, but I found if I laid down, I got a lot better numbers. So I just started doing them laying down. So excluding any weird positional changes,
Yeah.
it's pretty darn accurate to the point now that if I know that it's a trend and a pattern and they don't know what it was, that tells me there's something unconscious going on. Like the weirdest one I ever had was probably 5 years ago, was traveling, went to an event, was just a marketing thing. There's only a private group of people, 5 people there, stayed in Airbnb. Didn't really train much other than just 2 light sessions. My HRV just started just tanking. Like it went off a cliff like hard. I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, yeah, I feel a little bit more tired. It was, whatever. And I get home and it went up by like 15 points overnight. And I'm like, something was going on. And the only thing I could figure out is I was a new Airbnb, it was a guy's basement. And I didn't realize this till I got home and it smelled very dank and kind of moldy. And so my guess is I think there was some mold. There's something in that basement that was just tanking my HRV, where I didn't realize it till I got back. So again, like if you don't know consciously what's going on, I usually now believe that there's something subconscious that's happened. Another one was a training client. We're looking at all his training performance, everything is going good. And then he tells me about a big psychological event that happened in his life. And I'm like, yeah, that can definitely tank your HRV. He's like, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, like that can definitely do it. And he's like, I had no idea. And he didn't think to mention it because in his brain, he's like, well, this isn't related at all. So yeah, definitely, I think it's very useful. And I think it's probably still an underutilized tool because at the end of the day, you're still the coach or you're the person. You still get to decide what to do with it. Like I'll do a volume-based training program on a red HRV only because I've done it enough times to know that if I can get some decent movement for 40 minutes, it's going to be better the next day versus not doing it. Now, would I recommend that to a client on day one without knowing their patterns? No. But just because it's showing a poor reading doesn't always necessarily have to dictate exactly what you're doing. You're going to take that information, you're going to decide just like feedback on training, everything else, and then decide, okay, what is the best move here to do this? And you just kind of can run those experiments over and over and figure out for that individual what is going to be best.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen any of this with maybe like long distance athletes. I know that I've interviewed a couple like pro soccer players. And I didn't even know that HRV readings got up into like the 150s, 160s.
Oh yeah, they have some of the highest ever.
It's crazy.
It's insane.
Like it's unreal what happens when you run 20 miles a day and do a bunch of wind sprints and stuff in the middle and just constantly moving. If you see somebody that is that high and they're saying like call it 150 on average and then it drops to 100, is that anything to that'd be like my numbers dropping from 75 to 50 or something along those lines, where the 50 doesn't seem that scary. But if there was a drop in 50 points all of a sudden on a consistent basis, even though having an HRV of 100 is still world class. I know we're talking about a very small piece of the population, but would that be something that created sort of like a question mark, red flags in your brain?
Oh yeah. Yeah, because HRV, depending on the system and depending upon the person, will vary a lot. So the first thing I do with new clients is like we just take their HRV for 2 weeks. Don't look at it, don't do anything. Just trust me on this. Just do it for 2 weeks. I want to see what their baseline is. And then I'm going to go back and try to correlate it to training, nutrition, and they have a little questionnaire they fill out each day, like Travis was saying, and see if there's anything there to give us an idea. And I'm really looking for drops from their baseline, whether the baseline is 70, 100, 150, doesn't matter. So if they're hitting 150 and they drop to 100, that's a massive change. And that would tell me that's like a big red flag of like something's going on. And when you accumulate enough data too, you'll be able to see like, their 7-day trend, is it kind of trending up, down, or neutral, as opposed to, okay, one day it dropped real hard and then they recovered, right? So I look at those as acute versus chronic changes too.
Yeah, I was wondering, just because, if it goes from 150 to 100, that's still going to be what everybody else would go, holy crap, you're like triple digits on a daily basis, but it's actually, a massive, 30 something % difference in performance.
Yep. So on a health standpoint, they're probably still so high on that scale that all the health perspective and everything there is still going to be there. But that's an indication to their system and to their kind of way of living. That's a big change, and something's going on with them at that point.
Yeah. Going back and kind of thinking about the long distance runner side of things on the metabolic flexibility, are you specific to that goal of like you've got 3 of us on here, Doug, Mash, and myself, that are always going to be wondering how we get a little bit stronger and add some muscle. But if you have somebody that is interested in at the extreme ultra marathons or marathons, are the energy sources that you're going to be recommending to them going to be different than they would be for the more meathead Travis Mash?
I mean,
yes. The biggest caveat there is going to be what level of endurance athlete are they?
right.
And because like you guys have been around long enough to see all these trends of, oh, hey, endurance athletes, you need to be low carb. That's the best way to go.
That's the weirdest one, by the way.
And then you look at
I hear that one, I go, what?
Right.
Stop
You
it.
look at people winning marathons, not just finishing a marathon, but winning marathons. Like they're using almost 100% carbohydrates.
Hell yeah, because they're getting at it, man. They're almost doing a
Yes, they're running
sprint. Yeah,
fast.
yes.
Yeah, Kipchoge is not out there just jogging around doing 10-minute miles,
No, dude, no.
And so that's the first question I ask is like, okay, are you a high-level competitor looking to get better? Or like it's just on your bucket list. You're just like, I want to finish a marathon. Cool, that's awesome. Like that's great. If their times are lower, then we've got a lot more room. We can probably use a lot more fat, and I will actually probably push them more that direction because their rate, they don't need to go into carbohydrates as much. And if you can get them to use more fat, it just simplifies tons of stuff out of the equation. You don't need to worry about as much of external carbohydrates. You don't need to worry as much about having them upset their stomach. They miss a few stations or whatever. Like it just simplifies a lot of things. The cost being with that approach is you're probably not going to win marathons. I guarantee you're not going to win a marathon. But if your goal was just to complete one, that's actually a little bit easier approach. I'd argue that's probably a little bit healthier too. Now, as you get out into ultra endurance running and that type of thing, yeah, it gets even more weird. Like I think that you could make an argument for using more ketones and things like that. A guy who is actually working to be the first solo crossing event, Arctica, fully unsupported. He's actually in day 9 right now. So I helped him a little bit with some nutrition stuff. And so we talked about, the role of carbohydrates, the role of fats, the role of ketones, because he's got, I think it's 155 days. And the starting weight of his sled, I believe, was 410 pounds that he's pulling. So that's like the other bonkers end of like the extreme end. Plus, it's freaking Antarctica. You've got
Yes.
temperature to deal with on top of that.
Yeah.
So it's a similar concept, but again, it depends upon what is the length you're trying to go, how competitive are you, and then from there we can sub-select what's going to be the best method for you.
Dude,
I love
this
it.
guy, that's freaking me out. I won't sleep tonight thinking about some dude right now is tracking across Antarctica by
Yeah,
himself.
yeah. Look up. I think his handle on Instagram is Fearvana, actually. Yeah, awesome dude. Yeah,
God.
Just out there with Starlink, just updating people
yeah.
on his
Solo.
life.
Like he's the only one.
I mean, does he have any way of reaching? Let's say if things go bad, does he have a?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I
He'll be
guess
able
Um,
to
that's good.
communicate if it goes bad, but yeah.
They're
I
like, we'll see you
mean,
next week. Write it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah. He'll be able to
yeah,
communicate it's going bad. Now, getting someone to where he's at, that's a whole nother thing.
yeah. This is not gonna be. I can't give you an address.
Right, yeah.
I'm
Even if
like,
you find
just
the address,
uh,
Nice.
Mike,
latitude, longitude.
I actually
Ah,
met. Do you know who Ann Bancroft is? I think she's one of your
yeah.
Minnesota maybe friends. Um, Last time I was up at the Points retreat, she spoke there, and you just triggered me thinking about it. I had to go look up her name again because
Yeah.
listening to her talk about living in Antarctica, uh, absolutely wild. And that was like the biggest. Everybody's asking her about all of her like mental toughness to go and do this big event. I was like, what'd you eat?
Yeah.
Like, how did you fuel yourself? Did you lift weights before you went? How did you
yeah,
train? Like, I had so many questions that nobody cared about that were we like need her on here right now. Like,
yeah.
there's no grocery store in Antarctica to go get your favorite proteins, and you're just eating like MREs basically, trying to survive as you just hoof it across the
Man,
Antarctica. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
And the other thing too that becomes a huge issue is if you're pulling all your own food and supplies, like what is the weight versus the energy you're going to get out of that? Because you have to pull all of it.
yeah,
So that was a big discussion of, in general, fat is a lot more dense, but then you also have to consider like you're moving most of the day, like you'll only be able to sit usually in the evening and maybe the morning for a little while. So you've got prep time. Everything's freaking frozen unless you're trying to keep stuff next to
Yeah.
you. So this is the whole logistics of that. And then also people forget, like this happens with ultra marathon people too. I did was a person who helped at the Ram race once. So four people were, biking and trying to cross, San Diego to Atlantic City, New Jersey. And you forget that sometimes you have what they call taste fatigue. Like I remember like we're in friggin' Nebraska on day 3 somewhere. I won't say the name of the company we had like these prepared gels and stuff from. I showed one of the cyclists the container and he's like, if you even show me that container again, I'm going to throw you out of the trailer and I'm going to vomit all over you. He's like, I cannot stand that stuff anymore. And I'm sitting there going, oh my God, we've got like 3 more days left. Like, what am I going to do? And so I'm like, all right, man, like,
man.
well, what do you want? He's like, Fig Newtons. I'm like, Fig Newtons. He's like, yes, Fig Newtons. I'm like, all right. So we went to the grocery store. The guy lived on like 3.5 days of like multiple sleeves of Fig Newtons.
Yeah. Mike Nelson, where can the people find you, man?
Best place is the website, which is MikeTNelson.com. I've got a daily newsletter there. You can go to the little newsletter tab at the top. It's where probably 90-ish% of my content goes out. And then I do have some stuff, random updates on Instagram once in a while, which is Dr. Mike T. Nelson on Instagram.
Yeah, tell them about your cert since we just talked about metabolic
Yeah.
flexibility.
Yeah, we do have the cert, which is the Flex Diet certification. It was a mashup of metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting. And so we cover 8 different interventions from exercise, obviously nutrition, macros, sleep, NEAT, and we put it in a comprehensive system so people can learn about each one. And then we've got a fair amount of researchers on there too. And the nice part is we take all the research and then it's in a complete system. So they'll have the action items at the end of each one. So they'll know exactly what to do with clients that are in front of them. Because a lot of good other systems out there, but they didn't really tell you the big picture, the details, and then, okay, what do you exactly do with that information? So we wanted to try to cover all 3 of those areas. Yeah, you can just find it More info probably through the newsletter is the best place.
I love it. Coach Travis Smash.
Matchelite.com. One thing I'd like to shout out is my son, Rock, 10-year-old, wrote his first book and published it on Amazon.
Nice.
Stop.
He's a beast, dude. He is a beast.
What do you do? Tell me about it.
It's 101 Things to Do Before You Grow Up by
That's awesome.
Travis Rock Mash, T Rock Mash, they put. But yeah, it's go to Amazon, search for that, or it's in the link in my, if you go to any of my social medias, it's in the link in my bio. It's like the
if
top.
he does enough drop downs on Amazon, he'll be a bestseller for his Instagram profile.
No doubt, dude. Help me out, you guys. So yeah, it's actually a good book, and it's illustrated by my talented wife. So it's the illustrations are sick from
Putting
his
that in
mama.
the show notes.
Miss Emily.
Blow up, man.
Yeah, man.
Get that man investing his money already.
I'm proud of him. He's already writing his second book. It's the Adventures of Him and Bear.
Hell
So
yeah.
I'm proud of the kid. He's a beast. Way smarter than me.
There you go. Doug Larson.
Now I'm gonna smack my boys around when they get home, tell them to step their games up. Got other 10-year-olds out there writing books.
Can you believe how much of a letdown my kids are? Jesus.
Sorry, boys.
Good. Mike T. Nelson, appreciate you coming on the show, brother. I don't know
Thanks, guys. That was fun.
I don't know what episode this is together. Fucking 8 of them probably at this point, something like that. Many shows. You always deliver. That's why we keep asking you back. So again, appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
I am Douglas E. Larson on Instagram. Follow me there.
There you go. And I'm Anders Varner at Anders Varner. And we are Barbell Shrugged, Barbell_Shrugged. And make sure you get over to rapidhealthreport.com as where you can learn about all the lab, lifestyle, performance, testing, and analysis that we will be doing for you. And you can join us at Rapid Health Optimization. Just get over to rapidhealthreport.com. Friends, we'll see you guys next week.